Okay, it's my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Andrew Brenner from Hong Kong Baptist University, who will be talking to us about the role of simplicity in metaphysics. Over to you, Andrew.
All right, thank you very much. Is this a good volume? Can everybody hear me well? Okay, great. Thanks for doing the conference. I'm really excited to do this presentation. I call it The Role of Simplicity in Metaphysics. It's kind of a dramatic title. I'll say some stuff about simplicity in metaphysics, okay? And it's sort of split into two parts, okay, as we'll see. But we start off with a question about methodology. So there's metaphysics. What methodology do we use in metaphysics? What methodology should we use in metaphysics? One idea, actually, that we saw in Emery's paper, actually, we should appeal to empirical considerations where relevant, but we should also appeal to non-empirical considerations, theoretical virtues, for example, simplicity. And I'm going to focus on simplicity a lot here because I think it's more like maybe the most important non-empirical theoretical virtue. And on top of that, we seem to appeal to simplicity all the time, both science and everyday life. Here, everyday life construed broadly to include like history, criminology, whatever. For example, we might believe in universal common ancestry because it's simpler. It's simpler than the thesis that there's all these different species with similar bone structures and other traits, but they just happen to have these similarities by coincidence, right? So it's simpler to believe they have these shared traits because they have a common ancestor, right? And that's why we believe it. Or in everyday life, broadly speaking, you find a dead guy and you think there's a single murderer rather than some large conspiracy of murderers, largely because it's a simpler hypothesis. Metaphysicians, too, frequently appeal to simplicity in favor of their preferred metaphysical theses. So these are just some examples off the top of my head. You have like simplicity has been appealed to support mereological nihilism, presentism, theism, atheism, materialism, external world realism, necessitism, modal realism, the existence of individuals, other theses too. So metaphysicians appeal to simplicity all the time. And there's this natural question, why should we think simpler metaphysical theses are, in virtue of their simplicity, more likely to be true? So a common idea is this: well, simplicity seems to be truth conducive in science, and we might add in everyday life or in other contexts as well. And if simplicity is truth conducive in those contexts, then it's going to be truth conducive in metaphysics too. So we can appeal to it. One way of putting the argument, it would be objectionably arbitrary to think simplicity is truth conducive in science or everyday life or whatever, but not in metaphysics. And then you might say some other steps to support this sort of argument. You might think, for example, look, there aren't really determinate, precise boundaries between science and metaphysics, and whatever boundaries there are partially the result of or constituted by contingent historical and sociological factors, right? Like who among university faculty become interested in a particular question? Is it the scientists or is it the metaphysicians or whatever? And but those factors are irrelevant to what criteria of theory choice have epistemological significance. Or you might say, even if science and metaphysics do denote precise and clearly circumscribed domains of inquiry, the subject matter of science will almost certainly overlap the subject matter of metaphysics. So that if a theoretical virtue like simplicity is truth conducive in science, it should be truth conducive in metaphysics as well. So again, one example would be some biologists and philosophers of biology think debates regarding the unit of selection in evolutionary biology connect with debates regarding the metaphysics of composition and vagueness. Okay. On top of that, you might think, look, simplicity, maybe it's just truth conducive in general. And that's why it's truth conducive in science as well as metaphysics. Okay, so all of these sorts of considerations might lead you to think if simplicity is truth conducive in science or in everyday life or whatever, then it's truth conducive in metaphysics too. What should we make of that sort of defense of simplicity as a criterion of theory choice in metaphysics? Well, for one thing, it just assumes at the outset that simplicity is truth conducive in science. And I think that's right, but I actually don't think there are any very strong or probative arguments for the conclusion that simplicity is truth conducive in science or in everyday life. But here's what I'm going to do for the remainder of the presentation. That's more of like an introduction. Okay. So for the remainder of the presentation, I have two main goals. One, I'm going to respond to some objections to simplicities being truth conducive in metaphysics. Two, I'm going to go in a completely different direction and show how considerations regarding simplicity might have a surprising application in allowing us to make progress regarding a specific metaphysical issue. It's big mystery, it's big debate. Why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. So that's what I'm going to do the remainder of the presentation. So start with that first one. Here's some objections to this idea that simplicity is really truth conducive in metaphysics. The first objection is we have no positive grounds for thinking that simpler theories are more probable or more likely to be true, in virtue of their simplicity, whatever, in science or in everyday life. And actually, maybe this is right. But notice it's a general problem regarding simplicity as a criterion of theory choice. It's not a problem distinctive for simplicity in metaphysics. Here, I'm going to assume simplicity is truth conducive, at least in some contexts, like in scientific inquiry and everyday life. It's beyond the scope of this sort of presentation to defend the use of simplicity in those contexts. However, I think we need simplicity since it's the clearest way to adjudicate a pick between all these different empirically equivalent theses. Okay, so underdetermination or theories by empirical evidence, that's just sort of a very common phenomenon in both science and in everyday life. And I think we need simplicity or we're screwed. And I don't know if that's quite an argument for simplicity actually being truth conducive in science or everyday life. Maybe we should just be skeptical. We don't really know which of these theses is correct. But assuming we do know which of the empirically underdetermined theses are correct, I think simplicity seems like the clearest way to help us decide between these empirically equivalent theories. Okay. Here's another objection. And some of the people have given this objection, I don't know, like Kriegel, French, it's that it's often going to be unclear how to measure the simplicity of some metaphysical thesis, or how different types of simplicity weigh against one another. So a metaphysical thesis might be simpler than another metaphysical thesis in one respect, but not in another respect. So who wins in terms of simplicity? So once again, it's important to know this is a general problem regarding simplicity in theory choice. It's not a problem distinctive to metaphysics. But a second point is that this is a problem regarding the application of the criterion of simplicity in specific contexts. Okay? It's not a problem with the notion that simpler metaphysical theses are more likely to be true. It may be that simpler metaphysical theses are more likely to be true, but it's often unclear which theses are simpler. So strictly speaking, this objection, it doesn't actually conflict with the idea that simpler metaphysical theses are more likely to be true. But a third response is, look, it seems to me, maybe sometimes it's unclear how to tell which thesis is simpler than another. But I think there's some clear cases where one thesis is just simpler in every epistemically relevant respect than some other metaphysical thesis. So for example, I think mereological nihilism or compositional nihilism, there's no composite objects, composition doesn't happen. I think that's just simpler than its negation in every relevant respect. Okay, you remove composite objects from your theory, and you remove mereological primitives, terms like part, or proper part, or whatever. I think that only improves the simplicity of our resulting theory, and it doesn't add to the complexity of our theory in any epistemically relevant respect. So this is just one example where I think this metaphysical thesis just wins in every epistemically relevant respect with respect to simplicity. Here's another objection. The objection is, in science, unlike in metaphysics, non-empirical considerations, non-empirical virtues like simplicity, they're only used to decide between a relatively small number of empirically equivalent theories. Okay, so we use empirical considerations to narrow down a bunch of the different theories. We only have a few left, and then we appeal to non-empirical considerations. In metaphysics, by contrast, empirical equivalence is much more common, and we can rarely winnow down competing metaphysical theses on the basis of empirical considerations. That's the idea. And Amy Thomason, for example, used this sort of objection. Okay, I've got two responses. First, I think people often say that metaphysical theses in metaphysics, empirical considerations are usually, or maybe even always, irrelevant in helping us decide between competing metaphysical theses. I think that's true much less frequently than people say. Metaphysicians appeal to empirical considerations all the time. Sometimes these are more scientific, sometimes they're more everyday empirical considerations. So just some examples, as we saw again in Emery's presentation, special relativity is sometimes used to support eternalism. I think that was some of these presentations. The experience of temporal passage, sometimes people use that to support an A theory of time. Quantum mechanics is appealed to attack Humean supervenience or support priority monism or to support various other metaphysical theses. Quantum cosmology is sometimes used to explain why there's something rather than nothing. Brain research is sometimes used to attack or defend free will or attack or defend substance dualism. Evolutionary theory has been appealed to support animalism, the thesis in personal ontology. Cosmology is sometimes used to support or attack theism. Suffering, again, our experience, empirical considerations, suffering and happiness, is used to attack theism. Psychological data used to attack or defend the non-self thesis, the Buddhist non-self thesis. These are just examples off the top of my head. I think empirical considerations are just appealed to all the time in metaphysics. But a second response is, it's simply not true that in science or in everyday life for that matter, we use empirical considerations to winnow down a bunch of possible theories until we have just a few left, or maybe even just two left. And then we use non-empirical considerations. Actually, even after taking empirical considerations into account, we're going to be left with an infinite number of empirically equivalent theories, pretty much always. So we're going to need some non-empirical criterion, such as simplicity, to choose between them. Here's another objection. Ladyman gave us a objection. He says, in science, unlike in metaphysics, we actually don't need non-empirical theoretical virtues to decide between competing theories. We actually don't need them. We can just gather more empirical evidence. Right? So if you're wondering which of these competing theories is correct, you can always decide the issue by just gathering more empirical evidence. You don't need to appeal to non-empirical theoretical virtues like simplicity. So let me spell out the objection a little more fully. Ladyman says, look, there's different sorts of underdetermination. Local underdetermination is underdetermination with respect to some limited domain of inquiry. Here I mean underdetermination of different theories by our empirical evidence. There's global underdetermination, which is underdetermination with respect to reality as a whole. Weak underdetermination is underdetermination with respect to our current empirical evidence, the empirical evidence we've already gathered. And strong underdetermination is underdetermination with respect to all possible empirical evidence. He says scientific underdetermination is weak and local, meaning it's underdetermination with respect to some limited domain of inquiry, like optics, whatever. And it's underdetermination with respect to the empirical evidence we've already gathered. And this is why Ladyman says scientific underdetermination can always be resolved by just gathering new empirical evidence. By contrast, in metaphysics, metaphysical underdetermination is strong and global, so it's never going to be resolved by gathering new empirical evidence. And this is why we don't need non-empirical theoretical virtues in science, but we do need it in metaphysics. So you can't appeal to non-empirical theoretical virtues in science to support their use in metaphysics. That's the idea. Okay. But I disagree. So when Ladyman says all or most cases of underdetermination within science are cases of local and weak underdetermination, what he really means is that all or most of the cases of underdetermination with respect to theories which scientists actually take seriously are local and weak. Okay? And this is because scientists just implicitly rule out all sorts of theories on the basis of non-empirical considerations without explicitly addressing them. So like Descartes' evil demon scenario. That's a case of global and strong underdetermination. It's underdetermination with respect to all domains of inquiry, right? It's not just, the demon's not just deceiving us about optics or crystallography or something like that. The demon's deceiving us about everything. And it's strong underdetermination because no empirical evidence is ever going to tell you the demon's not pulling the strings. And yet, scientists don't take seriously Descartes' evil demon scenario. Why? Why not? I think in this case, they're just implicitly ruling out that scenario using non-empirical considerations, like simplicity. They're not ruling out the evil demon scenario because it conflicts with our empirical evidence, because it doesn't conflict with our empirical evidence. The demon can give us whatever empirical evidence they want. So if scientists don't take the evil demon scenario seriously, it's because they're ruling it out on the basis of non-empirical considerations, perhaps implicitly. So even with respect to scientific theories, there's skeptical alternatives to those theories, and we're faced with global and strong underdetermination, just like we are allegedly in metaphysics. So once again, these skeptical alternatives, they're ruled out by at least the tacit appeal to non-empirical theoretical virtues. And if we can break global and strong underdetermination in this case by appealing to non-empirical theoretical virtues, why can't we do that in metaphysics too? So in other words, I think Ladyman is just wrong when he says, in science, we never appeal to non-empirical, or we don't need to appeal to non-empirical theoretical virtues in order to resolve cases of underdetermination of theories by empirical evidence. I think we do need to appeal to non-empirical theoretical virtues, and we do it all the time. It's just often implicit or tacit, automatic. How many more of these do I have? Okay. Here's another objection to the use of non-empirical theoretical virtues like simplicity in metaphysics. The idea is arguments for simplicity being truth-conducive in science, they don't carry over to metaphysics. And people like Humer and Willard have developed this sort of objection. They say, look at this argument for simplicity being truth-conducive in science. It doesn't work in metaphysics. That's the idea. And then look at different arguments. And actually, I think once we look at those arguments, I actually think they're usually right when they say this argument does not support simplicity being truth-conducive in metaphysics. But that's because they're just not good arguments. They don't support the idea that simplicity is truth-conducive in science either. They just don't work. For example, right, just one example. They give a bunch of examples. You might think simplicity has proven its worth in science. We know from experience that simpler theories turn out to be correct, or they're more likely to turn out to be correct, or something like that. But I'm going to ask, well, like, why do we think this is true? Like, why do we think the simpler theories generally turn out to be correct? Why? It's not that they've turned out to be more empirically adequate, because they haven't. You can always construct more complex theories that are also empirically adequate. So I don't think we have a non-circular way of telling that simplicity has guided us well in the past, basically. We can also sensibly ask, even if simplicity has guided us well in the past in science, why think that pattern is going to continue? It seems like if you think the pattern is going to continue, simplicity is going to work in the future, you're probably tacitly appealing to simplicity. So this is just one example of the sort of argument you might give for simplicity being truth-conducive in science. And I say, no wonder that doesn't carry over to support simplicity in metaphysics. It's just a bad argument. Here's another objection. I think it's the final one before I completely change topics. Not completely, slightly change topics. Here's the objection. In metaphysics, we often have this dialectical situation where we can't choose between competing theories, since the disputants and the debates will modify the competing theories to make them more similar to one another. So Bennett and Willard have given this sort of objection. Here's the example they give. Earlier I mentioned meteorological nihilism, the thesis of the composition of miracles. In this case, Bennett says, you've got this debate between the nihilist and the believer in composition. The believer in composition downplays their extra ontological commitments to composite objects by saying that all it takes for there to be, say, like tables, is that there's symbols arranged table-wise. So they say it's no big deal that there's these composite objects. All that it takes for them to exist is that there's things arranged composite object-wise. The nihilists, on the other hand, upplays their expressive power by saying, look, there's no tables, but there's things arranged table-wise. So in this case, allegedly, the disputants are making their views more similar to one another. And since they make them more similar to one another, we're not going to be able to choose between them. So I don't think this is the right way to think of that particular case. And actually, it's the only example we give, I think, off the top of my head. The nihilists, for example, they don't really upplay their expressive power in a way which prevents us from deciding between the competing views. They use this arranged F-wise terminology. They say there's symbols arranged table-wise. But look, the non-nihilist is also going to have to use that terminology anyway, right? So if you believe in tables, you also think there's things arranged table-wise. You just normally have no reason to say that. So this isn't some new theoretical commitment, which the nihilist needs and their opponent doesn't. Everybody is going to need this sort of terminology or ideological commitment. On the other hand, the believer in composite objects, when they say something like all that it takes for there to be tables is that there's things arranged table-wise, they're not making their view more similar to the nihilist view in a way which prevents us from deciding between the competing theories. I think quite the opposite. I think they're taking on a new theoretical commitment there, which makes their view less plausible. So they're saying not only do composite objects exist, but there's also this true law or principle to the effect that F's exist when and where there are symbols arranged F-wise. So they're actually taking on a new theoretical commitment, which the nihilist doesn't need to take on. So this is a point that helps us decide between the competing views, because the belief in composite objects is, you might say, they're taking on added gnomic complexity with respect to laws or principles, by saying whenever there's symbols arranged F-wise, there's also an F. So once again, my overall point here is I don't think this dialectic, I don't think it's really a thing. Okay, so I think in this particular debate, for example, the disputants in the debate don't make their views more similar to one another in a way which prevents us from deciding between them. It's quite the opposite. The moves they make in the debate help us decide between them. Okay, here I'm going to change chat because I just wanted to talk about this topic. And also, it's maybe a surprising application of simplicity within metaphysics. Okay. So here I'm no longer going to defend the idea that simpler metaphysical theses are more likely to be true. Here I'm just going to give like a surprising application of simplicity within metaphysics. It might actually potentially help us explain why there's something rather than nothing, or at least shed some light on there being something rather than nothing. Okay, so here's what I mean. So when I ask why is there something rather than nothing, people mean different things by this question. In this case, I'm asking why does anything whatsoever exist? Concrete objects, abstract objects, anything that exists, why is there any of that? Notably, I'm not asking why any truths obtain. Sometimes people conflate these two questions. I'm not asking why do any truths obtain? There's really no alternative to truths obtain. So it's not an interesting question to ask why do truths obtain. I'm asking about existence. Now, many people think it's pretty surprising that there's something rather than nothing. When you think about it, why is that? Well, Leibniz, for example, maybe he hit the nail on the head when he said, nothing is simpler and easier than something. That's why it's kind of weird that there's something rather than nothing. It would have been a lot simpler and easier if nothing at all existed. And I can cite a bunch of people who have agreed with this. What I'm going to argue now is actually it probably is not true that nothing is simpler than something. In fact, this world, the actual world, might actually be the simplest possible world. Okay? Or at the very least, worlds where things exist are often simpler than worlds where nothing exists. So that's the thesis. Sounds obviously false, but here's the argument. First of all, think about an empty world. So an empty world would be a world where nothing whatsoever exists. There's no concrete objects, there's no abstract objects, there's nothing exists. even though nothing exists in an empty world, there's still going to be lots of truths regarding an empty world. Okay? We might call these non-ontological truths or non-ontologically committing truths because they're truths, but they're not truths about existing things because there are no existing things. So I'm going to call them non-ontological truths. Joni Ghazali, for example, in a slightly different context, he's not talking about the question of why is there something rather than nothing, but he says, look, there can be truths and falsities that are about nothing at all. More precisely, there are statements with truth values that are not determined by how it is with what the terms within them refer to. And furthermore, this is because some of the terms within these statements don't refer to anything. So here's some examples. Actually, here's all of the examples I can think of various non-ontological truths, which I think would obtain even if nothing whatsoever existed. The overall goal here is to show you, even if nothing exists, it's a pretty complex state of affairs, right? Even if nothing at all exists, there's still all these truths. So it's not as simple as you might think. So for example, here's like an obvious one, the truth that nothing exists. That's going to be true if nothing exists. More generally, there's going to be lots of negative existential truths regarding what doesn't exist. I don't exist, we don't exist, Spider-Man doesn't exist, and so on. Another non-ontological truth would be singular truths regarding non-existent individuals. I should say many of these are pretty controversial. So some people think there are no singular truths regarding non-existent individuals. For example, if Socrates had never existed, there would be no truths to the effect. There wouldn't even be the truth Socrates does not exist, right? I argue against that, but I don't have a lot of time, so just I don't have time to defend every little one of the claims I make here. Okay. But I think if nothing existed, there would be singular truth. So Socrates does not exist. That would also be true. There would also be de dicto modal truths, so truths regarding what's possible or impossible. Notably, I think these are non-ontological because I don't think they're truths about possible worlds or anything like that. If there are such things as possible worlds, which I doubt, they merely track truths regarding de dicto modal truths. The de dicto modal truths are not truths about the possible worlds. If nothing existed, there would also be truths regarding which states of affairs there are. Here, when I say states of affairs there are, I mean construed in nominalist terms. Okay, so I don't really think there's such things as states of affairs. What I have in mind here is like there's the state of affairs, there's the philosophy conference at the University of Helsinki. Okay, and there's some sense in which there being that state of affairs is logically prior to the modal status of that state of affairs, whether it's actual or possible or necessary or impossible or whatever. So that's what I mean by there would be truths regarding which states of affairs there are in a non-ontological committee. There would also be logical truths. For example, you've got the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, truths regarding logical consequence, lots of truths of this sort, even if nothing whatsoever exists. Hillary Clinton has this nice rant about this. Logical truths are not about any things. Maybe I'll skip that one. I think there'd also be mathematical truths, even if nothing whatsoever existed. And this is a big topic, obviously, whether mathematical truths are ontologically committed. But I think, of course, they're not ontologically committed. It's nuts. I don't think mathematical truths, for example, have anything to do with abstract objects. Like, what could it mean for the number 2 to be added to the number 3 and the number 5 just like pops out, results, right? I think it's simply bizarre to think a statement like 2 + 3 = 5 is about these abstract objects, 2, 3, and 5. Once again, a big topic, but if you find this sort of nominalist approach to mathematical discourse plausible, then you're probably going to think there can be mathematical truths even if nothing whatsoever exists. If nothing existed, there may also be truths regarding which laws of nature obtain. Okay? It could be an empty world with like Newtonian laws, empty world with non-Newtonian laws. Controversial, okay, but seems plausible to me. I think there would also be truths regarding counterfactuals. So even if nothing existed, you might think, well, if this thing did exist, then this would be the case, right? So it's right. Those sorts of counterfactuals. If something did exist, it would be like this. If nothing existed, there'd still possibly be many metaphysical principles that are true. For example, mereological laws. If you got objects arranged table-wise, they're going to compose a table. That could be true even if there's no objects of any sort. If nothing existed, you'd have real definitions. To be F is to be G. Some such truths are analytic, like to be a bachelor is to be an eligible unmarried male, but some are not. Like to be water is to be H2O. To be just is to have such and such traits or characteristics. There would be various truths of this sort even if nothing existed. There'd also be truths regarding properties construed in anomalous terms. Also, properties of properties. For example, the truth that blue is more natural than blue, or F is an intrinsic property, or red is more similar to orange than to blue. There'd be truths of this sort even if nothing whatsoever existed. There'd probably be truths regarding methodological values. For example, truths regarding such things as coherence, simplicity, and plausibility of theories. For example, this state of affairs is more complex than this other state of affairs. Even if nothing existed, there would be truths regarding probabilities. For example, maybe the intrinsic probability or prior probability of some state of affairs, or the probability of some proposition conditional on some other proposition. Again, this requires substantive philosophical commitments, like objective theory of probabilities, but that's fine, because that view is correct. I think there'd be truths regarding rationality and how it works. For example, the rationality of various beliefs, but the rationality of different decisions. For example, even if nothing exists, it may be the case that evidential decision theory is correct, or some other decision theory. There could also be truths regarding reasons for action, the strength of those reasons, and whether they aggregate. So even if nothing whatsoever existed, it may be the case that moral reasons are overriding reasons for action, or something like that. There would be various moral truths. There'd be meta-ethical truths. Is moral realism true? There'd be normative ethical truths. Is utilitarianism true? There'd be practical ethical truths, like if there were Ewoks, it would be wrong to pinch their fur. Even if nothing existed, there would also be truths regarding well-being. Is well-being objective or subjective? What makes a life go well or go poorly, and so on. There'd be truths of this sort, even if there's no living things. There'd also be aesthetic truths. Are aesthetic truths objective or subjective? What factors make something aesthetically valuable? Truths regarding how or whether those factors aggregate. I think there'd be various truths of this sort, even if nothing whatsoever existed. There'd be more general axiological truths, truths regarding value, beyond moral and aesthetic truths. And maybe even, this is the most dubious one, maybe even truths regarding the passage of time. If there could be such truths in an empty world, whether or not time flows, at the rate at which time flows, what time is present, and so on. There's this philosopher, David Barnes, I think he pronounced this guy, Innocent. I think he has an unpublished paper defending the idea that time can flow or whatever. There can be these temporal truths even if nothing whatsoever exists. So I think that's the most dubious one, but he's like a smart guy. He's got this paper, so and he defends this idea. So it's not totally crazy, or it's not obviously false. On top of that, there might be these non-ontological truths we haven't even thought of, okay? If you find any of these non-ontological truths or categories of truths plausible, then you probably should recognize there's probably categories of non-ontological truths we haven't even thought of. Maybe which are totally beyond our ken. Think of, and we can support that inductively, just like, well, we've thought of a lot of non-ontological truths, so there's probably more of them. Or you could say, think of all the other species on Earth who can't grasp pretty much any of these non-ontological truths. What are the chances we're the one species who can grasp all and only the non-ontological truths there are, right? Regardless, for my purposes, you don't need to agree with this whole list that I've just given. I just need to say there's some non-ontological truths, and these truths are such that they would obtain even if nothing whatsoever existed, okay? That's the idea. To show even if nothing exists, that's a pretty complex state of affairs. There's still going to be lots of truths. So here's the twist. If we could unify and so simplify all these non-ontological truths, that'd be great, right? Maybe if there was an existing thing which could ground or explain or account for these various non-ontological truths, that would actually simplify our total picture of reality, okay? Just like if we posit a common ancestor, that simplifies our picture of biological reality. Because we see, whales and horses and humans have similar bone structures. That's pretty weird. What are the chances, right? And then we simplify things by positing a single common ancestor from which we derive those bone structures. Similarly, if we have all these non-ontological truths, like that's pretty weird. Why are these truths there? Well, maybe in principle you could have some existing thing which unifies and so simplifies all these non-ontological truths. And that's how a world where something exists could be simpler than a world where nothing exists. If one of the things that exists can ground and unify all of these truths which would obtain, even if nothing whatsoever existed. That's the idea. So some like obvious candidates, maybe they're not obvious, but they're like the only ones I could think of are like God, or some sort of godlike being, some sort of initial cosmic state or object, like an initial singularity, or maybe even us. Okay, I'll go really quick. God, for example, theists have almost always thought, God grounds at least some of these non-ontological truths, like truths regarding laws of nature, truths regarding the passage of time, more controversially, moral truths, truths regarding well-being, general axiological truths. Even more controversially, God just grounds all truths, okay? People like Descartes, for example, thought if God wanted to make it that 2 + 2 = 5, God could have done it, right? And there's some modern proponents of this sort of idea. For example, Brian Leftow defends this sort of view on grounds of simplicity, just like me. Or you can have some sort of initial cosmic object. What I have in mind is like an initial singularity or something like that. And the fewer such objects, the better, because the simpler the proposal is going to be. It's not clear how some of these non-ontological truths could be grounded in some initial cosmic object, like a moral truth, but some of them it might work out. So I give an example from modal dispositionalism, for example. This is the idea that a state of affairs is possible if there's some past state of affairs which could have evolved into that state of affairs. And a state of affairs is impossible if one of the past states of affairs is not ontologically compatible with the formation of that state of affairs, something like that. On this sort of account, or modality, an initial cosmic object with an initial singularity could ground all of the moral truths. So that's just one example of how some of these non-ontological truths could be grounded in an existing thing. What about us? There's always been various forms of anti-realism, moral anti-realism, aesthetic anti-realism, moral anti-realism, and so on. So I have something like that. I'm trying to finish it up. I don't want to run out of time here. A less familiar example, John Wheeler, the physicist, he speculated that we might even create the laws of nature in our attempt to investigate them. Okay? I'm not saying that's right. That's an example of how an existing thing like us could potentially ground what I'm calling a non-ontological truth, like truths regarding laws of nature. Okay, here's the last slide. Suppose that a world in which something exists is actually simpler than a world in which nothing exists. What would follow? Here's like 3 proposals, which I'll just mention, and then we don't really have time to talk about them in detail. Well, maybe something's being simpler than nothing makes it less surprising that there's something other than nothing. Leibniz thought it was surprising that there's something because nothing was simpler. If he's wrong about that, then you shouldn't be surprised. The second proposal, maybe something's being simpler than nothing makes the existence of something rather than nothing less in need of explanation. And 3, maybe something's being simpler than nothing actually explains why there's something rather than nothing. Derek Parfit has this article where he talks about different ways there could be an explanation for why there's something rather than nothing. He talks about selectors, okay, which are like principles which could explain why one world obtains rather than another, like a world where something exists. In his terminology, we would have a simplicity selector here. That would be neat and tidy because they would also potentially explain why simpler theories are more likely to be true. If we have some sort of ground rock metaphysical principle to the effect that simpler states of affairs are more likely to attain, that could account for why there's something rather than nothing. And it could explain this methodological preference for simpler theories, or theories which posit simpler states of affairs or whatever. All right. So I know that was like a long I talked about a bunch of different range of stuff. But again, the 2 main themes, I think the use of simplicity as a criterion of theory, choice, and metaphysics is fine. Okay, I respond to some objections to that idea. There's other objections I didn't really have time for. And then simplicity has a role to play in metaphysics, which might be kind of surprising. I think it might shed some light on why there's something rather than nothing. So those are the 2 overall components of my presentation. I think we have like 10 minutes left because we started a little late. All right, but thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, we have 11 minutes for questions. Keep your hands up till I nod at you, and let's start with Nina here.
Thanks for the talk. So I wanted to get a little more clear on the type of simplicity that's playing a role in the why is there something rather than nothing part, and it actually ties into the beginning part, so maybe they're more connected than you were pitching them as. So at the beginning you had this, you mentioned these arguments I associate them with like Mary Beth Willard, that there's different kinds of simplicity and you're gonna be able to choose any theory you like based on some kind of simplicity. And you said it's not anything goes because mereological nihilism will win on any count of simplicity. Okay, so I was thinking, what about simplicity, something like simplicity of fit, or simplicity of the grounding relations you need between what there is and the way things appear to us to be. So here's a simple, it looks to me like there's a table. The simplest explanation of that is that there's a table.
Yeah.
And then it kind of sounded like that was similar. So you didn't talk about that at that point of the talk, but then it felt to me like maybe something like that kind of simplicity of fit between different, you could think of it as different levels of reality or different levels of description is part of what was playing a role in the second part. So there's all these truths and you want them to be grounded in something that exists, and that would be a simpler view or something along those lines. So can you help me understand what kind of simplicity plays a role in the second part if it's not something like that, simplicity of fit?
Yeah. I thought, I wonder if Emery is going to give that objection from our paper on. Because I know you have this article on nihilism and why you reject it, and it's basically what you just said. And so when I said nihilism wins in every way, as far as simplicity goes, I thought, I wonder if I should say anything about her article, because she's right here. But I didn't. And yeah, I'm not sure what to say in response to that sort of argument against nihilism. I kind of want to say there's a methodological preference you cite for there shouldn't be too much divergence between the way things seem to be and how they actually are, or something like that. Or at least that's a bad making feature of theory if there's a lot of divergence between how things seem to be and how they are. I don't know if I would cash that out in terms of simplicity. I think maybe in terms of likelihood ratios or predictive power or something like that. And then I'd say, well, whether or not there are some composite objects, things would look the same to us. So I might give that sort of response. However, that doesn't actually answer the question you're asking, which is what sort of simplicity is being appealed to here. I think philosophers and scientists sometimes get taxonomies and different types of simplicity. So philosophers like to talk about ontological and ideological, maybe gnomic simplicity and stuff like that. I think really sometimes I like this idea that simplicity has something to do with compressibility, right? So describing reality using less, right? So maybe deriving a lot of information from a little bit of information. I think that's really the core idea of simplicity, which is maybe manifested in different forms in terms of ontological simplicity or ideological simplicity, gnomic simplicity, whatever. I think they're connected to this underlying idea of compressibility. And that's the sort of approach to simplicity I was aiming for here, which why is there something rather than nothing? You might say a world in which things exist is more compressible because you can derive more truths from a smaller subset of truths or something like that. This thing exists and all of these other truths come along for free. Or most free, whatever. Yeah, so that's kind of how I was thinking. I was thinking in terms of compressibility here. And I think that's what's going on in many cases. I think that's more transparently what's going on in many cases where we appeal to simplicity. So I use this example of explaining features of different species by reference to a common ancestor. That seems like compressibility, right? We're sort of compressing our description of biological reality by positing this common ancestor. Okay, you posit this one little guy in the past and then explains all this other stuff. Yeah, so that's the general idea, but it's really complicated and difficult to like spell that out in detail. Like, so people try to give like, you know, algorithmic complexity and like Kolmogorov complexity, information theory, and all this. They're trying to cash out these ideas regarding compressibility and like, rigorous mathematical terms. I don't know how to do any of that. Okay, but I think there's something right about that. That simplicity has something to do with compressibility. Anyway, that was my idea. Does that actually answer your question? All right, yeah.
You've discussed the question whether simplicity is truth conducive in science. I think the question is ill-formed because if you mean by truth conduciveness something like it's more likely to turn out to be true in the future, then it's just about the predictive power of a theory. And predictive power just means that the theory has a better empirical fit if we take not only the present empirical data, but all the future empirical data. So two theories that are different in terms of truth conduciveness are different in empirical fit. And it's exactly the point of a criterion of simplicity to choose between different theories of the same empirical fit. So if you invoke truth conduciveness, it seems like you've subsumed a criterion of simplicity under a criterion of predictive power.
Yeah.
Except, of course, something like simplicity is already built in our conception of truth. But then again, it would be an analytic truth to say that simplicity is truth conducive.
Yeah, I don't think that's what I have in mind when I say truth conducive. So when I say simpler theories are more likely to be true than if they were less simple, that's what we're mean. That when I say more likely to be true, I don't necessarily mean more likely to be predictively accurate. Because in some cases, we might actually accept a theory because it's simpler, even if it's less predictably accurate. So I think like Schindler has this book where he gives a chapter of examples where we in the past scientists accepted some theory which was less empirically adequate than some alternative because it was simpler or satisfied other non-empirical virtues, right? Well, how can they do that? Well, they might say, look, maybe some of our empirical data is like a statistical fluke, or there's something wrong with our measurement instrument, or something like that. Actually, I think we do this all the time. Maybe you hear about some study where people had psychic powers or something. You're like, I don't know what's wrong with this data, but something's wrong with the data, okay? In that case, maybe that's just one example where you reject a theory that these people really had psychic powers, even though it's more predictively adequate with respect to our current empirical evidence. I don't know if that's the best example, but in any case, when I say truth conducive, I don't mean more likely to produce accurate predictions, simply because sometimes the true theory does not produce more accurate predictions, at least temporarily. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's making sense.
So we're really close to the end, so I don't think we have time for any.
Maybe ask it later. Yeah.
We have 2 minutes remaining. There are many questions, so we're not going to get to everyone. But a quick final question.
You spend a lot of time in asking whether it is simpler that there is something rather than nothing, because if there's nothing, then there's still a lot of truth. But if you use a classical logic, you don't get anywhere with that, because the theory about the empty world and the theory of world is ontic posits both of them have countably many, infinitely many truths, right? So for every sentence about the theory where there is something, there's either the sentence or the negation in it, right? Yeah. So if you replace now that by the empty world, then some of these truths will become false. So you replace them by the negation. There's one-to-one correspondence. Others, like the conceptual truth, in the empty world will be still true, as in the non-empty world. So if you use classical logic, you get nowhere, right? So it just gives you that perspective. It's maybe different if you have a three-valued logic where you say in an empty world there are more indeterminate truth
Yeah.
value sentences like in the non-empty world, or maybe you go to power-consistent logic, right? But, you know, this is my perspective, which I want to ask you what you think about that.
Yeah, actually, a couple of philosophers had said something like this already about this idea that empty worlds are simpler. They say, well, in an empty world, there's still an infinite number of truths. There's an infinite number of truths in a non-empty world. It seems the same. Yeah, I don't think simplicity is just a matter of counting the number of truths, because any theory entails an infinite number of truths. And so then you're going to have to say, no theory is simpler than another, which seems obviously incorrect.
But there's a natural bijection between them. That's the method.
Wait, so it's not
More than that, just.
then just counting the number of truths, which are.
It's bijection natural.
Oh, well, maybe you misunderstood me. What I was going to say is this is why I think simplicity has something to do with compressibility. I don't know if that responds to your concern, because it's a matter of deriving more truths from fewer truths, or something like that.
Just because you have the bijection, you can transfer the same degree of compressibility from that theory to the theory about the empty world, right?
Really?
See why I have this bijection.
I think I'm going to have to step in here.
Okay.
I'm sure this could
Maybe you think more about
carry
that.
on and can do during the lunch break, but it remains to thank our speakers once again.